Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and Compass director. Joining me to help manage the questions in the debate is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace. You all right?
Hi, yeah, I'm right.
She is all right, because I can see that she's all right. Look, these are unprecedented times and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and public service workers about how we come out of this thing in much better shape than we went into it. These conversations have live access for our members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate on a live call, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax and enjoy what is episode 3. So, in what would normally be a front page news story, Labour elected a new leader on Saturday after a protracted campaign that it feels like it started in a bygone age when a crisis was just Brexit or a historic election loss. Joining me this week to discuss what Keir Starmer's leadership means for Labour, wider progressive politics and indeed politics of this crisis is John Cruddas, the Labour MP for Dagenham and Rainham. John has been around Labour for, well, I think it's fair to say a while, working for the party General Secretary, then on employment issues, and since 2001 as an MP. He ran for deputy leadership in 2007 and got the most votes in the first round. He coordinated policy of Ed Miliband and set up Labour Together after 2015, from which many MP luminaries such as Steve Reid and Lisa Nandy are now enjoying frontline jobs with Keir Starmer. John has always swam, as I've seen it, in the deeper end of the Labour pool and has been close to Compass and its Good Society idea and the Progressive Alliance from the word go. So, the format of this call will be that I'll ask a few questions of John and then open it up to you, the Compass members on the call, for questions and comments before we finish bang on 7 o'clock. Please keep any questions or comments brief so we can get as many people in as possible. And as Zoom etiquette demands, please keep yourself on mute unless invited to speak. And please post your questions in the chat box. I don't know if there's only a chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of the bar on the screen to the right of the mute button. And finally, please note the conversation is being recorded and we'll be putting it out as a podcast later in the week. So, John, it's really good for you, a great of you to join us tonight. Let's start with, in these odd times, how are you and what does this mean? You were saying a bit earlier, but what does this mean for you as an MP and how's your time being spent now?
I'm good, thanks, Neil. And hope everyone else is out there and staying safe. It's a pretty intense, odd period. It is for everyone, but it is for MPs because we got, 70,000 people who we all represent, and there's a lot of people suffering and a lot of people really fearful and in need. So we're sort of spending all our time trying to build new safety nets, platforms, local coalitions to create floors and sort of try and passport people through new systems to deliver, especially for those who are the most vulnerable, or those, I suppose, the most newly vulnerable. So part of the job is literally sitting in Zoom conferences all day with the local health authorities, with the police or with the council or charitable and voluntary sector or with the faith communities. Another part of it is trying to lobby to get proper protective clothing or trying to audit what's going on in local private health or care sector, trying to offer support for small businesses locally, for self-employed. I suppose the best way to quantify it, as an MP, every week you tend to get about 600, 700 cases a week, people emailing or getting in touch with you, phoning, coming into your advice centre. And we're well over that now. We're probably in 4 figures a week. And at the same time, everyone's sort of isolated, working from home, all your caseworkers and everything. So trying to coordinate people as well as deal with an exponential sort of increase in the pressure on the office is quite challenging. But we're all trying to navigate through it as best we can. Actually, locally in Buck and Dagenham, we got one of the most challenging, I think it's one of the most challenging communities in terms of levels of deprivation in London. But there are really vibrant new coalitions coming together, as there is everywhere. So it's really challenging, but really interesting as well.
And I know because I've experienced a bit, but in Barking and Dagenham, at least you've got a council there that have sowed some of the seeds and dug some of the foundations of how do people come together, act in solidarity, act collectively. That must have helped, mustn't it?
Well, actually, we have been fortunate because the council's changed quite dramatically over the last decade. We sort of hit a red wall about 10 years ago before the term was the far right and everything, and that's forced new forms of civic administration. We're trying to think through years ago, trying to create new flaws, new forms of citizenship locally, and trying to create a different approach to public administration. So we've been able to tap into that. We've created a thing called Barking and Dagenham Can, which is a citizens alliance network. And we're literally pushing hundreds and hundreds of people through, and it's working. It's a sort of where the local state holds the ring, but then the voluntary, charitable, faith-based communities all pitch in, and new volunteer networks, etc. Now, it's different in every borough, but it's working really well locally. But that's only because it goes with the grain of some of the things we've tried to pioneer over the last couple of years. Yeah.
So, and that's a good local example. So, you know, in the bits in between all of those Zoom calls, trying to sort that stuff, I mean, where's your mind going in terms of what the bigger picture is? I mean, no one knows what this crisis, you know, how it's going to unfold, you know, or where it goes. But, you know, what do you see as the kind of contours that are emerging out of this, John?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, until a few weeks ago, I was sort of pre-pandemic, if you want. I was fairly clear about how the political land lay in terms of what the government was doing. It had an 80-strong majority. It had, you know, arguably its biggest majority since 1983. It had an economic strategy that was trying to really shovel investment into these red wall communities. So it had a bigger borrowing than under Brown, and it had a bigger state than under Blair. So there was something dramatic going on within the Conservative Party, and I think you could, alongside the economic strategy, see an assault on the public sphere in terms of the BBC, Channel 4, some of our universities, especially the social sciences, the Supreme Courts, the judges, new forms of voter suppression. All of that you could see alongside some sort of wedge cultural battles that they wanted to set up, challenging liberalism, identity politics, for example, transgender rights, and they felt quite comfortable where they were. But that's all been blown up. We've obviously got a health crisis. We've got this epic economic crisis coming down the road, and it is a global crisis. So all of the plans that the Conservatives have laid the footings for, if you want, no one really knows the outcome. So the big choice to me, or the big battle, will be whether this just reinforces the forces that have led us towards authoritarian populism across vast sections of Western economies, or does this allow for a proper dramatic rethink in terms of the lives we live, the politics we try and forge, and is this a radical new turning point? And you've got to say the jury's out. I mean, I don't know. That is a political battle for the future. And it's one that we all have to sort of get involved in because the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah, and so you detect a bit of virus determinism, you know, where before in 2008 we had a bit of crash determinism. This is bound to fall into the hands of the left. But I read Dominic Lawson at the weekend in the Sunday Times talking about, you know, a bonfire of regulations on business that's now going, you know, it's now taking place, and you can see how they could, you know, combine that with a Big Society 2.0 and put a new formulation. So, I mean, do you agree that the kind of, you know, the Conservatives' shape-shifting ability could, you know, come back again?
Oh yeah, I mean, I very much do actually. I mean, I've got a sense of foreboding. I don't want to be too deterministic about how this shapes up, but you know, they're obviously going to try and pivot into a new sort of austerity politics. They're going to use some big cultural challenges. They're going to use their majority to try and assault the basic architecture of our representative democracy. And they have this shape-shifting ability whereby they think they can reimagine a social fabric that will allow sort of the test driving of the big society to come through again some 10 years later. Now, all of that is subject to quite a big contest, but it means that we have to reimagine social democracy, or the purpose of the left, in a much bigger, bolder form than we have done, or have successfully done for quite a while. Now, I don't think that inevitably means that this is a moment for the left or right. It's just a fundamental political contest, the likes of which we've never actually been involved in, because things are, being reset all around us in real time in ways that we're all just having to try and render intelligible day by day, almost hour by hour, actually. So it's all up for grabs. And that's where the Labour Party debates have to come in, because, I don't know, Keir Starmer's got a big mandate. He's won in all sections of the Labour movement. The first moves he's carried out look like they're quite efficiently done. The shadow cabinet looks pretty good, pretty non-factionalised. So all of that's pretty positive, But given the scale of the challenge, have we the capacity to rise to it? Have we the culture in and around Labour? Have we the people, the platforms, the agility, the political memory to situate Labour within a broader coalition to fight for this new world? I don't know. He said very little in the election where he's just won. He hasn't got a real political character. He's only been an MP for 5 years, so we await his strategy, But it demands a radical overhaul of the purpose and nature of the party, its internal culture, the likes of which we've never really witnessed it being transformed so radically in terms of being commensurate with the challenge it faces. And we will see,
So where would you locate that, given your history and experience of being involved, as part of the kind of New Labour project, of being around the Miliband project, witnessing what Corbyn did, and I know you are kind of, sympathetic to elements of the moment that they were trying to respond to, and less sympathetic to some of the kind of the cultural nature of that project. So, where would you locate that, the challenge for Starmer in relation to those other ones? How big is it, and what can he learn from those other moments, John?
Well, you have to start with where the Labour Party is now, it seems to me, and it's heavily factionalised. It's been an ugly place, and I especially mean the Parliamentary Labour Party, which has been a really ugly sight for many years. It's lost 4 elections in a row. It's 11% behind the Tories, 160 seats behind. Where I sit in terms of looking at Corbyn is that in 2015 things had to change, and he was the only one with real energy and vitality and a view about how things should change. And it needed a drastic overhaul. Unfortunately, I think Jeremy promised, but was unable to really provide the change that was necessary, partly because of the factionalism, partly because of some of the more authoritarian elements within the left, partly because of the PLP, partly because of the problems with anti-Semitism. I mean, the list is sort of endless, But I would say, I think the 2020 candidates for leadership have been, as a team, more radical and thoughtful than those in 2015. And Jeremy was a necessary figure in terms of changing what the Labour Party had become. But really, we now have to almost put the jump leads on it once again, because of this present crisis that's engulfing us. Means that the Labour Party has to be very, very different than some sort of rewind back into a sort of Milibandism or anything that went before. This means something totally different has to be forged for this new challenge that lies ahead. Now, have we the capacity to do that? I don't know. I think, I don't know. We had a big first meeting of our Parliamentary Labour Party online today, which was very good, actually. It wasn't, it looks like we turned the page on some of the ugliness in the PLP. But the real question is, social democracy was on its knees anyway, right? The Labour Party, or Labourism, had sort of shrunken as a sort of agile political movement. And has it got the resources to really rethink its purpose in the modern day? I don't know, actually. I don't know. Sorry, that's not a very upbeat thing, because I think I don't think you can be too, optimistic or negative about this. I mean, we will see.
And where do you think we can look for? I mean, if there is a question mark about its internal inability to reinvent itself, where do we look to for sources of energy, creativity. I was going to ask you at the end, but you've kind of led us there. Where do you look now for inspiration, creativity, ideas?
Well, to me, it's all roads lead back to democracy, actually. And I actually, given the leadership election, I think the lasting legacy could be with the guy who left first, actually, Clive Lewis, because he really started talking about this at a democratic moment of constitutional and electoral reform in ways that we hadn't really been mainlined into the Labour Party for quite a long time. And even though it was a sort of shooting star a bit, I think that is the space. Now, Keir, as an internationally renowned human rights lawyer, he might well buy into the constitutional reform agenda. There are rumours that he is interested in it. In an era of surveillance capitalism, that really does offer you a route into radical overhaul of human rights thinking, economic and social rights. How do you defend the dignity of the human in this world that we inhabit? How can you confront some of these new platforms? How do you rethink the integrity of human beings in that world? And that offers up huge policy opportunities to really overhaul the purpose of the left. And the jury's out. No one knows which way he's going to go, but there are opportunities there if we have the political will to get there, and if we are prepared to work with organisations and not simply try to crowd out any other political tradition and be part of a pluralism which we've always been very wary of. I mean, that type of pluralism is a minority sport in Labour, as is an interest in constitutional reform, electoral reform. But maybe the present crisis will shunt that sort of type of thinking to the forefront, and he will sort of nurture that as the space that he can sort of own that will characterise his future leadership. I don't know, but the space is there.
And that's partly up to us to create the conditions which move him in that more pluralistic, democratic direction. Grace, do you want to start picking the first person? And just to remind anyone who's listening on the podcast that if you want to participate in the next one, then you can sign up at the Compass site at compassonline.org.uk/podcast. Join Compass and join the next call. So Grace, who's the first person you want to pick out?
So we've got Sue Shutter, who's got a question about how we work together. So Sue, if you're there, you should now be able to talk to us.
Hello.
Hi, Sue.
I mean, I can now not see what I wrote, but I was basically saying, how do we make sure that the things that we've learned during this crisis, to value people like, excuse me, like, care people such as care workers and refuse collectors and post deliverers, how do we keep that value going? And secondly, how do we make sure that however we pay back all the vast amounts of money that the government has borrowed for this is done fairly rather than as it has been done in the past through austerity?
Right. I think that slide just jumped straight into that.
Yeah, go on, John.
Yeah. Well, I think that is spot on, actually. I've been kicking around with a few people locally, whether we can build some principles to start our sort of political strategy on a local level. And I think that's what needs to be done nationally as well. So, for example, what would be the foundational propositions that would help us ensure that the economic sacrifice that happens is a shared sacrifice, that any future politics protects our liberties and our democratic institutions, that it involves front and centre a sort of a plan for a more sustainable living, that it involves fair and equal access to healthcare, that it enhances social relationships despite sort of social distancing. You can start to build some fundamental principles that that will encase any political strategy you develop, both at national and local level. And I think if we can build those basic principles that informs everything we do going forward, that could import a coherence that can ensure that this won't be gamed out by the right, to ensure that the poorest disproportionately take the strain, that we repeat some of the post-2008 outcomes. And that should be quite a learning curve that can inform our response to this crisis now. So I think we start with basic principles of solidarity, of future inclusive growth and shared sacrifice in whatever lies ahead to ensure that this doesn't reinforce structural inequality. Because already locally where we are, that it is the poorest that are suffering disproportionately already just in the last few weeks in terms of those sectors of the economy which has been stood down and are the most challenging in terms of getting fair recompense and the like. So I would start with basic fundamental principles that informs everything we do going forward. And I think that's where Compass could come in, actually, because some of the points I was making earlier on about constitutional reform, electoral reform, pluralism, alliance building, not wishing to crowd out other organisations, Compass would be a really good place to start working through some of those basic propositions that inform the work we do going forward.
And just quickly, and just from me, John, just to follow up on that, the problem is that the Tories are still going to be the majority majority party in Parliament.
Yeah.
Can we begin to kind of, work with any of them? Because in order to, get some of those foundations down, or is this all work until the next election?
Well, that's an interesting one. There is a project that one of the Conservative think tanks called Onward is doing, which is about rebuilding the social fabric of the UK over the next couple of years, that I said I'd get involved in, as is Shelter, as is Joseph Rowntree and a few other organisations. And I think there is, and it's got MPs like Danny Kruger, who have experience of the charitable and voluntary sector, used to do a lot of work with rehabilitating prisoners and prison reform. And I think we should offer to work with people who show an interest in terms of trying to rebuild the social fabric and make sure that there's a shared common endeavour, and it's not simply going to reinforce inequalities and foreshadow another era of austerity, the likes of which we've suffered in the last 10 years. And those people who want to engage in that debate, I think we should welcome them in.
Good. Grace, who's next?
We got Deborah, who's raised her hand with a question. So, Deborah, you should be able to talk to us now, hopefully.
Hi. I work as a... Oh, blimey, I've lost the picture. I work as a union officer. I'm also been a nurse for 30 years and elected in positions in the Labour Party. Now, the volume of traumatic detail that I'm dealing with, and all our colleagues in unions are dealing with in the middle of this crisis, has had a serious and negative impact on my ability to have any faith in people to come together in that nature of pluralism. What we've seen, the majority of the private industries that I'm dealing with overwhelmingly are breaking the law at an accelerating rate to protect their profits and throw people overboard. And the private industrial approach to what's happening with COVID seems to be dominating our responses. We're working incredibly hard to put structures in place. The government guidance is flawed, failing and grey. It doesn't give us authority, and lives are being put directly at risk. So coming out of this, how do we encourage a private industrial base with that approach to consider the sort of work that we want to encourage them into? What incentive, bluntly, is it to them to start cutting into their profits in the way that we think they ought to?
Yeah, we're doing some local stuff to try and shame that sort of behaviour and to call it out. Just like nationally in the Labour Party, we've been trying to put pressure on the government to make sure that there is a proper economic system and new safety nets in place. But I take your point, but I don't underestimate the difficulties in this going forward. I've spent a lot of the last couple of weeks chasing employers who are not carrying through on what the stated objectives of the government are in terms of how we should all be in this together, quote. They're trying to game out the system of economic support offered. They're trying to ensure that their employees, they swerve around the duties to those self-same employees. So I'm not naive in terms of the cynicism with which some people and organisations are using this. Make sure that they don't, with those with the widest shoulders, don't carry the load. I think part of it is about creating local partnerships and organisations to ensure that we call out and shame those organisations locally and nationally, actually, and put pressure on the government not to tolerate this type of behaviour. Because the sort of free riding that's occurring in the middle of an epic health crisis, I think, is morally reprehensible. And I think people will see that for what it is. So that does give us an opportunity to reset an ethical character to our political conversation. At the same time as people will double down on negative behaviour and cynicism and greed, I think we can see every day, we can see in the hundreds of thousands of people who've offered to contribute as volunteers in the health service, we can see the fantastic response to our frontline public service workers. I think it brings tears to your eyes the way they've been welcomed and supported. They are literally sacrificing their lives to support others in our public services. And I think that will reset the ethical character of the country if we make sure that that is the terms of the debate going forward. Now, that's difficult to do, but I think that's where the new leadership of the Labour Party could come in, as well as a new approach to working with other organisations and groups with shared ethical concerns as we go forward. It does create an opportunity for a new template and a new sort of drumbeat to the public conversation.
Thank you. I hope so.
Well, that is the nature of the political context to be played out as we go forward. And the way we do it, I know the Compass audience, it's almost compulsory to say this, but it's actually true. The way we do this and how we talk with people will show whether we have those ethical bona fides to build the type of politics we're talking about. It will be a show and tell sort of politics, actually.
Yeah, I think so. I think the key concern for me is the nature of the messaging. I have real concerns with the nature of the messaging that's coming out of government, the misrepresentation, distortion and outright lies that are coming out. And I think if we have to get the grip on our messaging and our comms in such a way that we aren't constantly fighting a battle on somebody else's territory in order to change the discussion in that way successfully.
I'll give you an example. This afternoon, I've just had some rows with some private care homes who we're getting whistleblowers from workers in there who are being forced to go in without the proper PPE.
Yeah.
They are selectively supporting people within the facility. There are, people are dying in there. They can't get families in there. This sort of behaviour, which is a long-term legacy of the way we've dealt with that sector, which we've been arguing about for decades. The chickens are coming home to roost. Now, that must allow the possibility for a dramatic rethink of the conversation of caring for our fellow citizens, when literally, 700, 800 dying a day at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Shut up now, let somebody else speak.
Thanks, Deborah. Grace, who's next?
All right, we've got James Perry next. He's got a question about business.
That follows on. Hi, James.
Hi, hello. And actually, yes, this follows on quite naturally from the previous conversation, because one of the things that obviously we've experienced recently is this unprecedented bailout by the citizen of business. But so far, the citizen hasn't given its terms for its bailout. And I suppose my question is, I see that this could be a once in a generation opportunity to reinvent business. So, does business serve society, citizens, or do citizens exist and the planet exist to serve business? Well, I think it is the latter. So the question is, how can we seize this moment when business is requiring the support of citizens, for citizens to have a big conversation with business about what its role is and how we might change the contract between business and society for the better.
Right. I think that's exactly the right sort of question that we should ask. What is a new covenant between the corporate world and the country they inhabit? It allows you to ask all the big fundamental concerns about what are their obligations. I'm listening to Gordon Brown. It was quite good to hear him on the radio again this morning talking about our global responsibilities to share what's coming down the tube in terms of the economic shakedown. Even though this is going to be a dramatic economic contraction, you can't waste that crisis to lay down the fundamental challenges that we want all sections of the country to stand up for. And that means I would go back to, I think I laid out a couple of principles in terms of shared sacrifice, of equal access to healthcare. Another few principles should be about the corporate responsibilities going forward in terms of sharing the burdens and choking off austerity coming down the tracks again. And that includes their ethical responsibilities in terms of how they employ and reward labour, their responsibilities to the local communities within which they draw their profits, their contribution in terms of infrastructure going forward. You can set down a whole series of fundamental propositions that we can build specific policies around as we go forward. If we can establish some fundamental sort of ethical propositions to rebuild a new type of politics and challenge the forces that are leading to sort of emboldened authoritarian populism across Western market democracies. And that seems to me to go back to the first question Neil asked, which was, is this a sort of how the future will be shaped? It will be shaped by us.
And James, do you want to just come in and just very quickly, very briefly tell people the work you've been doing with the B Corps?
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially, we take issue with this idea that the purpose of business is to maximize profits for shareholders. We think that is not what business is about. Business is a get shit done machine. The question is what you ask it to get done. So the B Corps are saying that all forms of capital, labour, land and capital, all three inputs need to be valued and remunerated. And we have a system of capitalism which only values capital, which makes it individualistic. So essentially it's a system of interdependent system of business which values everything rather than an individualistic system of business which values capital.
And an example on that, Neil, if I may. This is a very good one because it is an equivalent to a war effort. I have a very major car manufacturer. I'm not allowed to disclose which one this is, but we've been working for the last couple of weeks as part of a coalition to build ventilators. So we will be building in the constituency, tens of thousands of ventilators, because there is a different conversation that the government has led, and we've tried to build locally about what their corporate responsibility is. And that is built in a moment of crisis, because the world will be different from how it was a couple of weeks ago. And it's to us to lay down some new ground rules for that world.
The reason, I was glad that James jumped in is because he's, what the B Corps are doing are not waiting for government to demand stuff. Companies are changing themselves, in real time, abiding by the rules of the B Corps, which is this kind of, broader stakeholder approach, which is great. Grace, who's up next?
Okay, so on a slightly different topic, we've got Josiah Mortimer, who has a question about electoral reform and constitutional reform.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my main question is, John mentioned, sort of elements of constitutional reform which have been discussed in the Labour Party for quite a while now, but which Keir has expressed a sort of much more openness to than perhaps some of the Labour leaders. I mean, during the leadership election, he signed up to the Electoral Reform Society's pledge to consult members on proportional representation. He also committed to including PR in the constitutional convention that the Labour are planning to run.
Yeah.
But I just think the current sort of crisis that we're seeing will raise a lot of questions, obviously, about power and where power lies in society. The narrative that we saw before about low-skilled workers now being translated into key workers. But I think the disparity in power will be very clear after this crisis. And I was just wondering, John, if you had any ideas about how best to engage Keir and the Labour Party, I guess, machine now on the issue of constitutional reform in relation to all of these big economic and social questions that we're facing.
Right. I mean, the big fear to me, if I can be totally honest, is there's a danger always in crises and Labour, is that Labour always resorts to questions of economic utility. And and maximising welfare, quite understandably, in periods of economic retrenchment. Now, I welcome, as you did, the opening around Keir's leadership campaign around electoral reform and the idea of a constitutional convention. They're very much up for grabs, as I understand it. So we need to keep the pressure on locally in terms of our own councillors, councils, Labour MPs. I was going through some statistics for Labour MPs who support PR, and it's much higher than it has been for quite a few years now. There was Clive, I know, was sorted out a few meetings in the Commons just before the break around looking to Labour Party conference to get some positions set down on the agenda. So I think there's a lobbying exercise around the new leadership, the new leaders' advisors, which will become clearer over the next few days, I guess. The leader himself, backbench MPs, the new front bench, to try and make sure that we don't lose this moment to reset the debate around constitutional electoral reform. Because the danger is, even though all roads should lead in that direction, it will be seen as very much a minority sport and a second-order issue in and around the party when we concentrate on the fundamental economic issues in terms of the economic downturn. That's the big sort of fork in the road, it seems to me. Whether we can stop the usual sort of circuit in and around Labour, whereby economic crises kick in and all we talk about is economic utility, rather than the deeper questions of rewiring the economy and society-wide generally.
Good. Something the Compass will be working on and working with Make Votes Matter, Electoral Reform Society, the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform. Clive, I know John's involved in that, lots of other MPs, so it's definitely something we're working on whenever the next Labour Party conference is. Who's next, Grace?
So we had quite a few people asking about progressive alliances. So I think, Norman, if you'd like to ask your question about that.
I mean, my question really has been touched on, and that really was, how open Keir Starmer is to these ideas of a progressive alliance and of proportional representation. I mean, he's very much an unknown quantity.
Yeah, he is very much an unknown quantity. Now, I don't see that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are signs that he is open to this sort of agenda. Also, I think, hopefully, given his background, which I mentioned in our earlier conversation, as a human rights activist, renowned one, I think he might well see this crisis through the prism of human rights, both economic and social rights and democratic citizenship rights. Because obviously one of the big challenges is to make sure that this, the end of the lockdown, how we deal with the economic challenges, and not at the expense of our basic democratic architecture and our liberties. And hopefully that is one of the sort of building blocks to his leadership, that he will see the opportunities that this crisis will offer in terms of ensuring that we can re-establish a different sort of debate around forms of citizenship and the purpose of local government within it and electoral reform, especially pivoting out of the whole Brexit experience where all roads did lead to where does power lie and who has it. So maybe the pandemic on the back of the Brexit experience could well ensure that we do really get stuck into some of this constitutional electoral debates, the likes of which we sort of swerved around for many years now.
And did we have a question on Brexit? I know the question was, something about, the delay, John, to Brexit. There probably will be some sort of delay.
Yeah.
What does that mean? For how long? I mean, and what does this mean for our relationship to Europe, I guess? Is it going to get stronger, or weaker as a consequence of the crisis?
I think it goes back to, we don't really know. My fear is, obviously, a global pandemic. And you can see it in some of the language that Trump initially used. You can see it, the way they'll use an economic crisis down the road to do what they've done for years now, which is to almost reinforce this sense of we're an island nation, English economic sovereignty, othering the origins of the pandemic, the way that it can play into the building blocks for this authoritarian populist thing that we've seen exploding for the last decade or more. And it will just put, it will intensify the forces that have propelled us in this direction over the last decade. Now that's one route. The other route is, can it allow us to rethink the very purpose of the human experience, the lives we live and our relationships with others? And can we forge a new politics around that? And have we the creativity in and around labour as part of a plurality of economic, social, democratic forces to challenge that trajectory? Because that is one route that is quite probable in the months and years that go ahead. That's why this question of the not just electoral reform, but the Progressive Alliance is absolutely vital here. I mean, that's why I would say there's a lot of the work that Compass has done for years, which has been very unfashionable in and around Labour, could really be a useful resource in and around Labour now, around electoral reform, constitutional reform, progressive alliances, constitutional reset around devolution, all of that. It could be the moment for it to come forward. Now, again, there's a lot of ifs and buts there, but almost not knowing where Keir Starmer stands and some of the things he's intimated over the last few weeks, it may mean that there is a sort of combination in time and space for us to jump forward on this agenda.
And as we've learned in the past, the polls will go up and the polls will go down, but unless we lay and build the foundations of, relationships, culture, ideas across progressive politics, then it doesn't matter what happens to the polls, we won't be ready, And I think, one of the things we've got in our favour now is we've got some time.
Just on the Brexit thing, then I think there is a big trap game here for us, though, which is some of the reasons where I had slight concerns with Keir, is that the danger here is a new series of binaries, which we saw in some of the Brexit debate between young and old, educated, non-educated, town versus city, leave, remain. I think we can get trapped in all of that in terms of this zero sum playing on one side of the pitch or the other. I think we have to get into a bigger transcendent conversation about the very purpose of humanity now, and how we can build coalitions to create a different world we inhabit, and not just play on either side of the pitch, leave versus remain. We can't play back into that. And I think there is an immediate trap for Labour to be calling for an extension to Brexit, because it could be seen as simply trying to reheat some of the Brexit debates in the current crisis. And I think the Tories will try and trap us in that one, which is we have to keep an eye on that.
Okay, good. Time for a couple more. Who's next, Grace?
I think so. We had a quite general question from Colin about the kind of imagination and thinking that we need to be doing. Colin, if you can hear us. Colin Miller, sorry.
Hi, yeah. Hi, John. It was just something that you started talking about in your opening words when you talked about it was necessary for the party to go forward to do some really fundamental big thinking. And you've talked a lot about the need for democratic and constitutional change. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about the other wider issues that you might have had in mind in that statement.
I've been round the policy-making track in Labour quite a few times, and it usually starts off quite hopeful, and it usually ends in being quite disappointed and depressed about the path not travelled, if you want. Having said that, even though I'm not optimistic, I am hopeful that this time round, the sheer scale of the crisis engulfing us will force us, it will propel all political parties of the centre left into a different world, because literally our fellow citizens and everyone on this call will know someone who is been in intensive care, or is really suffering, or is a real worry to them in their immediate family or friendship circles. And that must mean that it's possible that in real time all around the country there is quietly a rethink about the lives we wish to live and the purpose of politics more generally, that a political generation, a new political class could speak to. That's why the issue of central to that, to unleash those forces, to allow them to percolate and inform the political conversation. New forms of citizenship to armour people to engage in that debate is absolutely vital. And the way we can put pressure on the future Labour leadership to own this agenda is all possible. So that gives me hope rather than optimism. So I would say there are three elements to it. One is an organisational strategy to rebuild the party, so it's professional, but also is plural. So there's an organisational change that's needed. That's why the Progressive Alliance is vital there. There's a political change in terms of future policy direction, and then there's a deeper ideological change, which I mentioned earlier, in terms of getting away from a sort of cold utilitarian approach to politics and tap into some of these more fundamental questions about human dignity, human rights, human purpose, and the virtues that we want to nurture both in our fellow citizens and the world and the country we inhabit. And that is a bigger conversation that Labour, if it has the capacity, and that seems to me to be the question, if it has the wherewithal to get into that deeper water, there are real rich opportunities there for progressive politics in the country. But it's a big if, I know.
Okay, good. Maybe one more, Grace. Anyone else you found?
Yeah, we've got Ruth Lister here who's got a question. So Ruth, if you can hear us.
No, it wasn't really a question. It was really engaging with other people, because a number of people have been talking about rethinking the sort of proposed immigration rule in terms of, who are going to be let in as care as workers. And I was saying we need to go even more fundamentally and revalue care work itself, which is something that feminists have been arguing for decades, but everyone can see it now. It's just staring everyone in the face that these people we have undervalued, disrespected, ignored are now absolutely key workers in our society. So it's more a comment than a question, but I think it speaks to what John's talking about in terms of human dignity, recognition, respect for the contribution that everyone makes to our society.
Well, as always, Ruth puts it much better than I was tempted to do. But there's always, it seems to me in such a profound moment, it goes to fundamental elements of our human personality in terms of our experiences of grief and loss, fear, anger, trust, kindness, hope, our mental health, loneliness, the compassion that we feel for other people, our sense of responsibility to one another. The fundamental questions of who we are as human beings are now centre stage in politics. Now, can we then crystallise that in terms of our approach to public services, care, the insider-outsider issues around immigration, a renewed sense of human well-being in terms of how we approach the economy and the obligations of capital within that? What are the sort of building blocks ethically in terms of the society that we will want to build coming out of this experience that none of us have ever gone through before? That must create a sense of political rupture. Obviously, before the crisis, there was a great desire for change. Can we, coming out of this crisis, build on a sense of change and align it with political organisations that are agile enough to speak to that and push it forwards? And that's always how I've seen Compass, as a sort of a base camp for all of those sort of forces that want change. And can we sort of interpret this rupture rather than just a crisis? It is a fundamental rupture in terms of how we're living our lives and whether we're actually going to carry on living in similar ways. But a different story of how we can reorder society, which is basically the fundamental question of justice going forwards. And that is what basically Compass was created to achieve. So it's a huge opportunity, even though I'm not over romanticising the ease with which we're going to do it.
So thanks, John, and thanks everyone. Just as a final question, John, I mean, I know you've kind of looked at the work of people like Paul Addison and his book, The Road to 1945. It's kind of like, what do we learn from that kind of, I mean, that was 100-year conversation. It was this
Right.
White House that got us to that moment.
Right.
And it was kind of, it was liberals and even some conservatives and Methodists and, trade union. I mean, all sorts of angles came together to create that moment. What do we learn from that moment, and how do we apply that to the 21st century, the 2020s, and what's been deemed this war against the virus compared to a war against another nation? What do we learn from that, and how does that spur us on, and what does it tell us?
Well, putting me on the spot with that book, Neil, I seem to remember the key thing I remember from that Addison book was he talked about the tributaries towards 1945. Right, this didn't fall out of the sky. It wasn't a rupture. It wasn't a simple page-turning exercise. There were different forces that very much predated that crisis and what came out in post-45, but they were they navigated towards that moment in different ways, but then were aligned by political strategies and forces and coalitions coming out of that shared sacrifice of the wartime experience. Now, if you see this as commensurate with a epic rupture that is bigger than war, actually, could be, in terms of fundamentally challenging how we live our lives, there are also resources to build on. Now, that's why I raised the question about whether Labour has the resources to build on, because when I think of Compass, I think it has more resource for this moment than Labour. And I go back to 3 publications many years ago we're involved in, which was the Good Society, Good Economy, Good Democracy. That's a sort of 3-volume pieces we put together. Must have been the late 2000s, was it now?
Yeah.
Now, they were really good staging points into this present crisis. They were sort of tributaries into the moment we're living in now. We have resources, we have a memory, and we have a sort of culture in and around the Compass space that I think is, more than anything I've seen in and around Labour, aligned to the moment we are inhabiting and will inhabit for quite a few months and years ahead.
Okay, John, thanks for that. And thanks for a brilliant conversation. Lots and lots of richness in there. I hope people have enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being part of that. Your support as members is what makes these kind of events and all the work we're doing possible. And I've hoped you've noticed the kind of big upturn in publications, articles, campaigns, and meetings like this that we've been doing. I hope people who are listening would want to sign up to Compass, compassonline.org.uk/podcast. You can always email me or contact me. I'm on Twitter @Neil_Compass, or you can get hold of Compass on Twitter @CompassOffice. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard on the podcast, give us a rating. But finally, thank you, Grace, for helping us manage that. Thank you again, John. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call. There'll be another call next week with another exciting speaker. Until then, everyone, just keep really safe and really well. And I look forward to connecting again next week. Take care.